This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Brought to you by the Capital One Saver Card. With Saver, you earn unlimited cash back for going out or staying in. That's unlimited 4% cash back on dining, at a restaurant, or on takeout at home. 4% back on entertainment, from the front row of a game or on popular streaming from your couch. And 3% back at grocery stores, where you'll find everything you need to make the meals that make their day. So earn unlimited cash back with the Capital One Saver Card. Capital One, what's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com for details.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
I stood at the border, stood at the edge and claimed it as central. I claimed it as central and let the rest of the world move over to where I was. So goes the famous statement by the high priestess of African-American fiction, Toni Morrison. And today on Open Book, we're honouring that outsider legacy with stories from the hinterlands. Later on, I'll be speaking to two writers who bring subculture to the fore in their fiction. But first, a writer who is often described as being daringly nonconformist. Matrix is Lauren Groff's fourth novel. Her previous books, Fates and Furies, Florida and The Monsters of Templeton, are all unashamedly ambitious. But while The Matrix continues some of her recurring themes around women and climate change, this time the historical world she constructs couldn't be more different. It opens with illegitimate 17-year-old Marie being banished from the court of her half-brother Henry II by his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. Marie is sent to an abbey in a cold, isolated part of 12th century England inhabited by starving nuns. Becoming the abbess, she inspires a new generation of nuns to build a sort of utopia, free of men and surrounded by an elaborate labyrinth built to keep the outside world outside. And I'm delighted to say that Lauren Groff joins me now in the studio. Welcome to Open Book, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
With historical novels, we often ask who was the real person behind the story and how much artistic license the writers use. But you've drawn on the life of both Marie of France and Marie, Abbess of Shaftesbury, who may or may not have been the same Marie. Could you tell us a little bit more about these people, or as the case may be, this person?
So I fell in love with Marie de France 20 years ago, but we don't know anything really about her. We just have suppositions. As you said, she may have been Marie, the Abbess of Shaftesbury. She also could have been one of Eleanor of Aquitaine's first daughters from her marriage to Louis, the French king. So she could have been anyone. Who knows? Which was glorious as a writer because I had the outlines of the time. I had, of course, the outlines of Eleanor of Aquitaine's life that I had to adhere to, but I could make up the rest of Eleanor's life based on her work. So what I did was I took her lay and her fables and pulled images and ideas out of both that I really loved and then built a biography on top of those images from her own work.
So her creativity came first and set the foundation for this biography. As I was reading this book, I got the sense that you had a lot of fun writing it. And I don't usually ask that kind of question to a writer because writing's not always fun, but it did seem that you enjoyed writing this book.
Absolutely. Well, this is part of my philosophy of art, right? I think if it feels like a painful book to have written, it probably was, and it will be for the reader as well. And so I do try to seek out the joy. And when I sit down to write, if there isn't heat for me in the pages at hand, I know I have to find the heat. I have to go and look for a way into the text that is enjoyable for me as well.
And I wanted to ask why it was so important that your Marie in this novel is not only the one who turns around this decaying 12th century nunnery, but was also a writer. Why was that important?
Well, I mean, Marie de France came first, right? The actual figure of Marie de France. And so her work had to be in that. But she expresses herself, her love, her desire to leave through writing. It's her only way out of the Abbey. Her only way out of the Abbey is an intellectual way, in writing letters, but also her own work as well. And it's the way that she sort of slowly pushes her power out into the world as well, right? I think for Marie, in order to understand who she was, she had to write the lay. She had to try very hard to get back to the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she had to fail.
And what was it specifically that made you want to conjure this story in the first place?
Well, I was in the throes of the Trump presidency, to be very honest. And living as a woman at that time in America, it felt as though there was a disaster happening every single day. I was being constantly buffeted by these tsunamis of horror and shame in my country. And I didn't feel as though I had enough distance to be able to write about the contemporary world with the urgency that I wanted to write about it. Instead, I thought perhaps historical fiction in which the past and the present are having a conversation, a very deep conversation. Perhaps that's the way to talk about the contemporary world, but to talk about its slant.
Yeah, because, actually, that sense of putting up barriers to keep, the outside world outside and the influences away and building a fixed, isolated communities is quite pertinent to now, isn't it? Whether we're talking about nationalism or the digital world.
Yeah. And what it means to be in a community versus what it means to be a rugged individualist, right? I mean, I think that's at heart the deep problem with at least America and possibly your slightly more democratic society here. I think that we have this inherent fight between community and individualism, and so understanding what a community is, what it could be, and what the disasters inherent in a community are, I think that's something interesting to look at as a novelist.
Been a lot of discussions about people writing solely from their own experiences, and this surely couldn't have been further from your experience, unless you've been dining out with banished queens and having visions of the Virgin Mary in fields of rye.
How do you know I haven't?
So yeah, what was that like, sort of delving completely and utterly into this other world?
Well, Marie, c'est moi, right? I mean, just like Emma Bovary for Flaubert. So she is me in a lot of ways, right? She feels too large. I'm a tall woman and I take up a lot of space. And when I was a kid, I was on all men's teams for swimming and track. And, I was not acceptable in my gender terms. Nobody
ever told you that you were 3 heads too tall, did they?
No, I'm only about a half a head too tall, which is pretty tall if you're 12 years old. No, nobody ever told me that. And nobody ever told me to my face that I was hideously ugly either, unlike Marie. But it's different times, right? Someone would be sued for that now. No, I feel as though Marie was an insider and an outsider at the same time. And I think for a character who in this book has to be both. She has to be the source of power and also the underminer of power. She has to be as large as possible and as intelligent as possible and have enormous blind spots that only the reader can see, and she couldn't see herself. So,
Lauren, could we hear a reading, please?
Sure. When Marie makes a low noise in wonder, the abbess says, "Yes, Romans. Something to carry water, I think." She hums her song again, and Marie marvels at the kind of people so magnificent they can create something to last 1,000 years beyond their lives. Humanity must be disintegrating to dust. The people of today paltry in comparison to what they had been a millennium before. The Romans, the Greeks, such giants compared with the Normans, or far worse, the paltry, brittle-boned English. In 1,000 more years, humans will be as thoughtless as the cud-chewing kine of the fields. She longs to be among the greats of the generations before. Marie might have discovered others like herself in that era. She would not have felt so alone.
Often with feminist or queer historical fiction, and this novel has elements of that, but isn't purely defined by that. But in queer historical fiction, there's often, more artistic license at work because those marginal voices were so rarely recorded in the past, or in some cases have actively been obliterated. So would you describe writing them as almost a kind of wish fulfillment?
Wish fulfillment, maybe. I know that I did rely on a lot of the thinking of this great academic and writer, Saadia Hartman, who talks very much about going back into these historical places and reimagining what has been erased. So There is definitely an element of wish fulfillment. I mean, the title Matrix responds to that because it is in sculpture the form on which other sculptures are sort of copied, right? And in this book, I don't want to give anything away. There is an idea that this could have been an alternate path for Christianity or for Catholicism in at least England for a while. Whether or not that pans out, one would have to read the book.
Well, it seems a good time to ask about the kind of the natural world, and in this novel, it's a harsh one, and the human characters are locked in battle, trying to contain it. There's a passage where Marie hasn't realised the destruction she's caused to the local wildlife through her matrix. And we were talking last week about eco-fiction ahead of the COP26. Why do you think it's important that even fiction in the distant past needs to engage with environmental issues?
Well, first of all, climate change is not a new phenomenon. Anywhere there's human beings, there has been climate change, right? Our first ancestors in the forest, standing in front of a lightning-struck tree, taking an ember from it and throwing it into a pile of leaves, was engaged in climate change, right? Mm-hmm. They were changing the leaves into what would have become food for worms. But the other thing, too, is at the moment we're in now, we are in the Anthropocene, and things are exacerbating on a daily basis. And the project of art is not escapism, right? The project of art is the opposite of escapism. It is to engage as fully as possible with the urgencies that are the most real and the most large. And I think that just like historical fiction shouldn't be escapism and should talk about the current moments that the book has been written, I think we can look back at historical times and sort of see the roots of how we came to be where we are. That's what I want to do with all my work.
Lauren Groff, and her novel Matrix is published by Hutchison Heinemann. You're listening to Open Book with me, Johnny Pitts, on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
With a backdrop of pebble-dashed Lego houses, invisible linens, high-vis yellow trousers, moving through the streets, take away food and Scooby-Doo repeats. Shoulder slouch with a skewed view. Music from Lee Scott's album Nice Swan, perhaps a precursor to his new novel Swan Songs, about a 20-something rapper called Leonard Swanson, whose dreams of making the perfect hip-hop album are under threat from the parochial northern town he lives in and some seriously surreal happenings at the factory he works at. And I'm happy to say that Lee Scott is with me in the studio now, and we're joined on the line by Eddie Oche, one half of the writing team responsible for The Junglist, along with Andrew Green. It's a cult novel that was first published in 1994 about the underground music scene in London. Although published nearly 30 years apart, what both novels have in common is an offbeat documentation of working class life in Britain and the subcultures surrounding it. Welcome, both of you, to Open Book. I wanted to start by saying I'd describe you both as Renaissance men. Between the two of you, there's the running of photography studios and music labels, graphic design, DJing and music production. In the introduction to Junglist, Sukhdev Sandhu says the book's prose vibrates as much as it documents. How much of your photography and your music seeps into your prose, Eddie?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of my music. My music is something that's really quite personal. I'll come home at night, I'll turn on my MPC, I'll bang out some beats, and equally by the end of the night, I'll turn it off and never save a thing. But in many respects, it becomes a soundtrack to my thoughts in my head. And I think certainly when I was revisiting Junglist, the idea that these words were actually streams of consciousness that rode over the rhythms that we'd hear in the clubs, that we'd then leave these clubs in the middle of the night, go home, writing on the way back in the cars, writing on the bus home, writing the experiences that we had. It's very much the vocal to the rhythms of the streets, of the clubs, of the time.
And is it true, Eddie, that you'd write a lot of this novel at like 4 a.m?
Yeah, pretty much. Always after hours, always after midnight, sometimes even in the club. You'd be formulating these thoughts and these streams of consciousness as the rhythms are rolling over you. And in some ways, they were punctuated by the MCs on the stage who would, scream their sort of narrative and their lyrics, which will then sort of punctuate your own thoughts. You know, if you've never been to a rave, if you've never had this experience, probably the closest thing I can imagine it to is the bit after the yoga when they put the nice music on and the guy says that's some nice things in your ear. That's kind of what drum and bass was to me. You know, it's that moment.
Lee, in your novel, you play around with words a lot. And I'm just thinking of like the Harlem Renaissance poets like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, how they included the rhythm of jazz in their sentences. Is that the same for you in hip-hop?
Yeah, 100%. Like, most of the time as I was writing it, I was reading it aloud to myself, and everything had to have a certain rhythm. I guess that just comes from the way I write rhymes as well, you know.
And there are lots of parallels between your novel Swan Songs and then your album Nice Swan, and which we heard at the beginning. Why did you want to make that move from music to literature?
I've always considered myself like to be like a lyricist, and I've always liked to play with words. I've always had like some forms of narrative in what I rap about, and I just thought written a lot of like short stories that have turned into songs, because that's the only way I knew. You know, I'd had no idea how to write a book, so I would turn everything that I wrote into songs. So then eventually it was just, I had these short stories and little half ideas, and I was kind of writing a book before I realised I was writing a book, you know, in honesty, you know. And
did you know where you were going with the story?
I definitely knew where I was going. I just needed to guide everything in the book to where I was trying to get to, and by doing that I stumbled upon millions of mini tangents within tangents, you know.
Yeah.
Like...
And those flashes are like magical realism, where it's like what's real and what's not. I found that fascinating. Eddie, before I ask you about your memories of the time in which you wrote Junglist, could you give us a reading?
I'm going to sort of give it a little introduction purely because the book sort of... It's not a typical novel in any way, shape or form. It's, as young men, we were very much about reflecting our consciousness. And so there are streams of consciousness. And I'm quite proud of those things, because these streams of consciousness were the thoughts that we had that was part of us turning from boys to men. And so here we have Fight Gravity. Bright lights, big city, London at night. Home of the brave, land of the free. They circle and wheel, spinning balls of light. Maelstrom of identity, slack and soft, smooth and sweet. A city, the city, never to disappear under the waves like Atlantis. Huge shimmering waves of grey, white, slanting hand, hard across the night sky, transmogrifying into a dark cover of shadow, a duvet of inkiness, an ink well poured across the sky, lights twinkling, red and white, emanating, reflecting. Look up, see the clouds, lift from beneath, buildings just like fingers pointing towards the heavens, stretching up, ever reaching, the heavens await, ascension is upon us, spiral upwards, DNA, double helix, spiraling, turning, compression of space, life, the city, concrete, heaven, glass, hell, driving, slanting, rushing, claustrophobic center of gravity, can't get out, always drawn back in.
What I think connects both books as well is the kind of flouting of traditional literary rules. Like, were you aware of that, or were you just doing what came naturally?
Yeah, it's an interesting process. It's an interesting place. I found lately in the last 10 years that the only place I can write now is on a bus or a train. I have to be within my society to actually speak about it, speak within it. And that's quite an intriguing process. But I became very much aware that my writing style was pretty much a product of growing up in London and being part of the Inner London Education Authority, because I went to school at a time when they thought literature was authoritarian and right-wing, so they got rid of it in my school. So I never learnt literature. I never learnt grammar. My writing style is a reflection of someone who's never been coerced into form or rigidity. It's just a style. And I only was aware of this because years later, as part of my role as a curator at National Portrait Gallery, I had to study grammar. I just had no idea where to put a full stop. So when I did, I was taught by the very people that removed grammar from school. And they were like, yeah, you know, this is something we thought was radical and wise at the time. And now we are teaching grammar to the very people that were never taught grammar. But I felt like maybe they were right. Maybe my free flowing and my free flow form of writing is okay.
What you were saying about like writing on the bus and what have you, it's almost like, do you feel like that's because of like an agency? Like you have to be like as close to the source that you're writing about as possible? Like you have to... you know what I'm saying? You've got to capture the feeling while it's there.
I think there's a lyric
with your camera.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's a lyric in one of Common's tracks where he says, sometimes I ride a bus home just to touch home. And I kind of feel like I want to touch that emotion, that space, and if I'm on that bus at the right time of night on the right Friday nights, and I'm going to work with my words and wrestle these rhythms and these emotions and these energies, these voices all around me, those vernaculars, I'm sitting right in that pocket. That's where I want to be.
That's fascinating. It's interesting too, I think, that both works are published by Repeater Books, which is an imprint set up by the late cultural theorist Mark Fisher, who it's almost like you echoed a lot of his thoughts there, Eddie, and the British novelist Tariq Goddard. Lee, how did you connect with Repeater Books then? How did they learn of you, or how did you learn of them?
There's a novelist who is published through Repeater called Carl Neville, and he one day, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, he just emailed me out of the blue based on the Nice One album. Yeah. So he's a fan of the album. I guess within him listening to it, he thought he could hear a book within the lyrics, I guess, And then he just emailed me saying, have you ever written anything? But just him saying that, and whether it was real or not, I just was like, all these things that I've been writing, I was essentially writing a book without being conscious of it in a way,
Do you think there's something societal at play here, where it's like you weren't taught to think of yourself as a writer growing up, Yeah,
definitely. Definitely. It's in the wrong room, you could definitely feel like you're an imposter. Do you know what I mean?
I wondered, then, what kind of advice you both had for would-be writers who don't necessarily feel that the literature world is for them. Eddie,
I've really enjoyed Repeater, Tariq, Carl, especially, for bringing us in to the fold into this world and contributing our voices to what seems like a culture war that's going on in Britain at the moment, and contributing in a way that makes us feel relevant because we have a genuine story to tell, and I would like to think that everyone has a genuine story to tell, and this imposter syndrome is kind of an interesting thing because it was amazing when Tariq Repeater brought us into this system, being able to interview with the Financial Times, with serious heavyweight magazines, and have really deep, beautiful conversations about our society, that I realised that actually these stories are more important than ever, that perhaps maybe coming from where we come from, that no one else has said what we're saying. That may be a truth. And maybe for any other writer coming up, you may be surprised. No one of your history, your background, your culture has ever spoken on paper. The written word is still a great leveller.
Both books are really fresh, and thank you so much for joining me. My thanks to Eddie Oche and Lee Scott. Junglist is out now, and Swan Songs is released in December, both by Repeater Books. Finally today, the Booker shortlisted Japanese-American author and polymath Ruth Ozeki. She's also a filmmaker and Zen Buddhist priest, and shares with us her most treasured book.
The book I would never lend is my 1974 edition of the Riverside Shakespeare. And it's the edition that I had in college. It feels a little unwise to be talking about Shakespeare here at the BBC, but I'm going to take the risk and do it anyway. It's a compilation of all of Shakespeare's work. I think it was first published in the late 1800s. It's a scholarly edition, so it has essays and notes about the plays. It has all of the sonnets as well. Because there's so much material that has to fit into this one volume, the pages are very, very thin, sort of tissue paper thin, and the font is very small. So even now I have trouble reading it with my aging eyes. So the reason I would never lend this book is because it's filled with all of the marginalia and the underlined words and the circled words and the little, the notes. I was just learning literary language then. So, in the margins, there's notes like paradox with an exclamation point, or, foreshadowing, or mythopoesis and apostrophe, oxymoron, all of these words that were magical to me. A lot of this came from my teacher. His name was Professor Young. And I remember, again, just so clearly the way that he would limp into the classroom, with his cane. He had lost a leg in World War II. And he used to drive around campus in a golf cart. He was just a wonderful man. He was very sardonic, but when he recited, his face just transformed into something else. So when I look at the marginalia in my Riverside Shakespeare, I can imagine him. I can see his face, as he's kind of gazing out the window, looking at a blooming crabapple tree and reciting bits from A Winter's Tale or from The Tempest. It was almost a coming-of-age ritual to buy this book. And I remember, bringing it home and, again, just that something significant had happened. I'd sort of moved up and gotten just a little bit closer to adulthood as a result of having this. Studying it in college, I just, fell more deeply in love with the language. And so much so that, I had a sense that after college I wanted to go on to do graduate work and really become a Shakespeare scholar. That was kind of my ambition. But again, it was sort of the late 1970s. I remember being discouraged by my teachers who looked at me, as a half Asian Anglo person, and kind of discouraged me from pursuing this. I remember them saying things like, "Well, maybe you should study classical Japanese literature. Maybe you could do comparative literature. That would be a good thing." And so I tried. I took their advice seriously. I went to Japan. I did a master's course in Japan. I studied no drama, thinking that I could do comparative theater. The texts were beautiful. They were poetic. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it the way that I loved Shakespeare. So what I'd like to read is Sonnet 129. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame. Savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Enjoyed no sooner but despised straight. Past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit, and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have extreme. A bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Before, a joy proposed, behind, a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. Often when I'm writing and feeling a little bit dull and sort of uninspired, when my sentences start feeling rote, my diction starts feeling conventional, I'll just pick up my Riverside Shakespeare and open it at random to a passage and just read out loud for a little while. And it never fails to kind of wake me up. I mean, little bits of Shakespeare seem to find their way into all of my books.
Ruth Ozeki was talking about the Riverside Shakespeare. Her latest novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, is published by Canongate. That's all for today. Just enough time to mention that on Friday the 22nd of October, Elizabeth Day and I will be at the London Literature Festival recording a special edition of Open Book, all about friendship. We're joined by Andrew O'Hagan, Emma Jane Unsworth and Aisha Malik, who've all written novels which celebrate beautiful, complex and enduring friendships. Tickets are free and you can register at southbankcentre.co.uk. Don't be shy, come along. Next week, Elizabeth is here talking to Sarah Hall, who began writing a new novel, Burnt Coat, on the first day of lockdown 2020. Find out how it shaped the story next week. And until then, goodbye.
What if where you were born inspired your life's work?
Whenever they would spray DDT, it made me wonder, how did it impact us?
Hear about the life of environmental justice activist Catherine Coleman Flowers on That Made All the Difference, wherever you get your podcasts.